July 7, 1937, near Lugo Bridge, Beiping, China. Twilight. The evening air was thick with the scent of dust, sweat, and spent gunpowder. Crickets sang from the marshy banks of the Yongding River, unaware that history was cracking open at their feet. A line of Chinese soldiers from the 29th Army stood rigid beside the ancient stone arches of the Marco Polo Bridge, their rifles clutched tight, bayonets fixed. One soldier, barely 20, stepped forward. His uniform was wrinkled and sweat-stained, boots scuffed from endless patrols. But his back was straight, eyes burning with defiance. Across the bridge, Japanese troops in gleaming helmets advanced, rifles raised, not yet firing, but demanding submission. The Chinese soldier did not flinch. Instead, in an act that would never be written in official dispatches, he spat on the ground, turned his body sideways, and stared down the Japanese formation with quiet contempt. Not a word. Just a stare. No one moved. But something in the world shifted. Moments later, a gunshot rang out. No one knew who fired first, but in that instant, a fuse was lit. And the Second Sino-Japanese War had begun. In the summer of 1937, the streets of Beiping, what we now call Beijing, bore the illusion of peace. Rickshaws clattered down stone-paved alleys, students recited Confucian texts in candlelit classrooms, and market stalls brimmed with the smells of fried dough and fresh melon. But beyond the city walls, war drums had been beating for years. The seeds of full-scale war were sown long before that defiant Chinese soldier took his stand near the Marco Polo Bridge. The tension between China and Imperial Japan was not sudden, it was simmering, festering, and slowly boiling over since the turn of the century. The conflict began not in 1937, but in 1895. In the First Sino-Japanese War, Japan shocked the world by defeating China, a power once seen as the central civilization of Asia. The Treaty of Shimonoseki forced the Qing dynasty to surrender Taiwan and recognize Korea's independence. But more than land, China lost prestige. Japan, fueled by rapid industrialization and Western-style militarism, had proven it could beat a giant. By the 1930s, Japan's ambitions had grown. The military, increasingly dominant in Tokyo, viewed China not as a neighbor, but as a resource. A place to extract coal, iron, land, and power. In 1931, Japanese officers staged an explosion on the South Manchurian Railway and used it as a pretext to invade Manchuria. Within months, they had created a puppet state, Manchukuo, ruled by the last Qing emperor, Puyi, now reduced to a ceremonial puppet. China, fractured by warlordism and internal divisions, could not mount an effective resistance. By the mid-1930s, Chiang Kai-shek had emerged as the central figure of the Chinese nationalist government, the Kuomintang, KMT. His capital was in Nanjing, but the reality of China was more fragile. Much of the nation was controlled not by a centralized government, but by warlords loyal only to their regional power structures. In the north, the 29th Army held control over Beiping and Hebei province. Nominally loyal to Chiang, the 29th was a product of compromise, a semi-independent army led by General Song Viluen, who had to balance pressure from Nanjing and encroaching Japanese forces. Meanwhile, Chiang had been focused less on fighting Japan than on defeating the Chinese Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong. From 1930 to 1936, Chiang launched a series of campaigns against the Communists, believing internal unification was essential before resisting foreign powers. But in December 1936, everything changed. In a dramatic moment of modern Chinese history, Chiang Kai-shek was kidnapped by one of his own generals, Zhong Xueliang, in the city of Elevenhan. Zhong, formerly the warlord of Manchuria, was furious that Chiang was not fighting the Japanese. He forced Chiang, literally at gunpoint, to agree to a united front with the Communists against Japan. With that agreement, however fragile, China entered 1937 with a new focus, resisting Japanese expansion. But the unity was brittle. And the Japanese army was not going to wait. The Japanese forces stationed in northern China were under the command of the Kwantung Army, an aggressive, largely autonomous force notorious for operating beyond Tokyo's orders. Their officers believed in a divine mission to expand the Japanese Empire across Asia. To the Kwantung commanders, the Marco Polo Bridge, known as Lugukyo in Chinese, was more than a crossing. It was a symbol. A perfect pressure point. Just 15 kilometers southwest of Beiping, the bridge was near a walled town called Wanping. It connected rail lines and roads critical to controlling northern China. And nearby stood the Chinese 29th Army, under General Song Yun, under-equipped, under-trained, but fiercely protective of their ground. In early July 1937, Japanese troops began conducting night maneuvers near the Marco Polo Bridge. Officially, they claimed it was routine. But the exercises were intentionally provocative, loud, aggressive, and conducted without notifying Chinese forces. On the night of July 7, a Japanese unit conducted another such drill. At 10:40 p.m., gunfire erupted. What happened next is still debated. The Japanese claimed that one of their soldiers went missing during the drill. They demanded to enter Wanping to search. The Chinese commander refused, citing sovereignty. At 5 a.m. the next morning, the Japanese opened fire on Wanping. Some say the first shot came from a Chinese sentry startled by movement. Others suggest the Japanese staged the incident to justify an invasion, just as they had in Manchuria 6 years prior. But in the muddy dawn hours of July 8, fighting exploded across the bridge. Machine gun nests lit up. Mortars pounded the town walls. And the Second Sino-Japanese War had officially begun. The Chinese 29th Army, armed mostly with outdated rifles and bayonets, resisted ferociously. They had no air support, few heavy weapons, and limited communication. But they held the bridge. For days, the battle seesawed. Chinese units counterattacked with brutal determination, often charging Japanese positions with nothing but fixed bayonets and grenades. Photographs from this period, like the one that inspired this documentary, showed Chinese soldiers not cowering, but standing tall, glaring at the enemy with unshakable resolve. The soldier who showed contempt toward the Japanese was not alone in his spirit. Across northern China, from peasants to professional soldiers, thousands prepared to resist the coming tide. The soldiers of the Chinese 29th Army were not elite troops. Many came from rural villages with little formal military training. Their uniforms didn't match. Their rifles were decades old, often German Mausers from World War I, or even older Qing-era stock. Ammunition was limited. Radios were scarce. Yet, when the Japanese demanded to search Wanping, these men didn't yield. They had grown up under foreign humiliation, witnesses to the fall of Manchuria, the rape of sovereignty, and the slow bleeding of Chinese pride. They fought not because they were ordered to. They fought because surrender was no longer an option. One unnamed sergeant in the 219th Regiment reportedly held his ground on the Marco Polo Bridge for over 14 hours without rest. He was finally seen slumped against a parapet, his bolt rifle still warm, surrounded by spent shell casings. His body was riddled with shrapnel. His eyes remained open. Militarily, the clash at Lugo Bridge was a mismatch. The Japanese had a clear advantage in firepower, coordination, and mobility. Their forces used Type 38 Arisaka rifles, supported by light artillery, tanks, and Mitsubishi Ki-2 bombers. Even small infantry units could call for close air support, something the Chinese lacked entirely. Chinese forces under General Song Yun fought with outdated weapons. Some units had only grenades and fixed bayonets. A common tactic was to allow the Japanese to advance across the bridge before launching close-quarters ambushes. Urban combat in Beiping became brutal, house to house, bayonet to bayonet. Despite the disadvantage, Chinese defenders showed surprising tactical awareness. They set traps, created bottlenecks at narrow alleyways, and sabotaged roads to slow Japanese tanks. A platoon of Chinese sappers reportedly collapsed part of the bridge to prevent a flanking maneuver. For a military used to easy victories, the Japanese were shocked by the intensity of the resistance. The war at Marco Polo Bridge symbolized a greater contrast, a 19th-century army vs a 20th-century one. Japan, by 1937, had invested heavily in mechanized warfare. Their infantry units coordinated with bombers and artillery. Trucks moved men and supplies quickly. Radios enabled battlefield communication. China, by contrast, relied on telegraph lines, runners, and flag signals. The 29th Army had almost no armored vehicles, no air force, and little ammunition for their limited artillery. Much of their firepower came from civilian-converted weapons, black market arms, or captured rifles from warlord battles. A Chinese squad leader once recounted, "We had one machine gun for the entire company. When it jammed, we used bricks." And yet, despite this gap, the Chinese defenders managed to delay a modern army for days. General Song Vuyuan, commander of the 29th Army, was a complex figure. A veteran of the Beiping warlord era, he was a pragmatist who tried to maintain peace through negotiation, but also a patriot. When the Japanese demanded full access to Beiping, Song hesitated. But once fighting broke out, he resolved to resist. His decentralized structure gave junior officers autonomy, many of whom chose to fight to the last man. Song's own headquarters came under fire during the opening hours, and rather than flee, he reportedly moved to the front line to observe artillery positions personally. On the Japanese side, General Mosokozu Kawabe and the staff of the North China Garrison Army had prepared for confrontation. But even they were surprised by the scale of resistance. The Kwantung Army had expected another incident to result in quick capitulation, as it had in Manchuria. But Lugo Bridge did not fall easily. In Tokyo, alarm bells rang. What was meant to be a brief skirmish was turning into something far more serious. Imperial Japan's military doctrine was based on superiority and speed. They believed Chinese forces, divided and poorly armed, would always capitulate under pressure. And historically, they often had. But this time, the Japanese encountered something different: national will. The contempt shown by that single Chinese soldier, his quiet defiance, mirrored a broader shift across the nation. Young Chinese men were enlisting. Volunteers poured into military stations. Even peasants began organizing resistance militias. One Japanese officer was recorded in a field diary. "We thought they would flee. But they stood. Even without bullets, they fought. This is not the China we expected." In Japanese press briefings, the Marco Polo Bridge incident was portrayed as a minor conflict, a misunderstanding. Tokyo issued statements claiming that both sides would de-escalate. Negotiators were dispatched. But on the ground, reality diverged. The Japanese army continued to pour troops into northern China. Reinforcements arrived by rail and air. Bombers began flying missions deeper into Hebei province. Towns outside Beiping were shelled. Villages were razed in punitive operations. For many historians, this is the moral turning point. July 1937 was not an incident. It was a declaration. From this moment on, Japan was no longer posturing, it was invading. And China, despite its internal fractures, had drawn a line in the sand. The image of the defiant soldier, staring down the Japanese troops, filled not with fear but contempt, is now seen as a symbol of something greater. A nation choosing to resist. A people refusing to kneel. July 8, 1937, Beiping, China. By dawn, the skies above Wanping were painted in smoke and ash. Chinese defenders clung to the stone walls of the town like shadows, firing from crumbled window frames and sandbagged rooftops. The Marco Polo Bridge, ancient and scarred by bullets, groaned under the weight of combat. The Japanese North China Garrison Army, under General Mosokozu Kawabe, had begun full offensive operations. Artillery units were rolled into position by 4 a.m. Infantry companies advanced from 3 directions, east toward the bridge, south toward Wanping, and west to flank the Chinese trenches beyond the Yongding River. The Chinese 29th Army, already battered from the first night's skirmish, now faced a modern coordinated assault. Japanese Type 92 heavy machine guns raked the walls. Mortars fell in a steady rhythm. Still, the Chinese did not abandon their posts. At 6:20 a.m., a Chinese counterattack surged from the west bank. 2 regiments charged across the marshland with bayonets fixed, screaming slogans of defiance. They reached the base of the bridge, engaged in hand-to-hand combat, and forced the Japanese back temporarily. But the cost was devastating. At his command post in Beiping, General Song Yuen received reports of mounting casualties. His staff advised withdrawal. Wanping would fall within a day if reinforcements didn't arrive. But Song issued a defiant order. "We will not give up Beiping. We will not abandon the bridge. If the army falls, I fall with it." Even as Japanese planes began bombing roads and communication lines, Song rallied the remnants of his divisions and dispatched emergency orders to local garrisons to converge on the capital. By July 9, nearly 100,000 Chinese troops were engaged across a 30-kilometer front. Realizing the Chinese were not backing down, Japan deployed additional forces from Korea and Manchuria. Reinforcements from the 20th Division and 1st Mixed Brigade crossed the Yalu River and were rerouted toward northern China. On July 10, fighting erupted in Langfang, southeast of Beiping. Chinese railway guards and militia ambushed Japanese trains, destroying bridges and derailing supply cars. The Japanese responded with a harsh crackdown. Whole villages were burned in retaliation, civilians executed under suspicion of aiding Chinese forces. In Tianjin, a vital port city, Chinese units engaged Japanese Marines in street fighting. The city, which had once housed foreign concessions and elegant Western architecture, was now a battlefield. Shells cratered the boulevards. Fires raged through merchant districts. What was once a localized firefight had become a regional war. On July 14, under orders from Tokyo, General Kawabe's forces launched an all-out assault on Wanping and the Marco Polo Bridge. Bombers from Tachikawa airfield made repeated runs, dropping incendiary bombs and fragmentation charges. The 29th Army's lines finally buckled. Reports from the ground described mortar shells landing every 30 seconds, entire platoons erased in minutes. One survivor recalled, "There were no more orders. Only survival. We could not hear our own thoughts, only explosions, screaming, and the crack of rifles." That night, the Japanese breached the southern gate of Wanping. Close-quarter combat broke out inside the town's narrow alleys. Japanese flamethrower teams incinerated barricaded defenders. Civilians caught in the crossfire fled or hid in cellars. Many didn't survive. The town's fall seemed imminent. Incredibly, despite the overwhelming firepower, elements of the 29th Army refused to surrender. A company of Chinese sappers barricaded a warehouse and turned it into a fortress. They held out for 36 hours, running out of ammunition and hurling bricks and bottles filled with gasoline as improvised bombs. The bridge itself became a symbol of the stalemate. On July 15, after 2 weeks of fighting, the Japanese had failed to fully secure it. Beiping had not yet fallen. And in the minds of both commanders and civilians, a chilling realization had set in. This was no longer a military incident. This was war. Down in Nanjing, Chiang Kai-shek received hour-by-hour updates from Beiping. He had hoped to contain the conflict through negotiation, but public pressure mounted. Protests erupted in Shanghai and Wuhan, demanding retaliation. On July 17, Chiang addressed the nation. A nation cannot stand if it does not resist. If we desire to avert war by concessions, then we shall have war with disgrace. But if we resist, though we may suffer, we shall have war with honor. That speech marked the final turn. The Chinese government committed itself to full-scale resistance. Mobilization orders were sent out. Railways were converted for troop movements. And communist forces, despite their deep mistrust of Chiang, began positioning to fight under the Second United Front Agreement. Despite valiant efforts, by August 8, Beiping was surrounded. The 29th Army, exhausted and decimated, began a fighting withdrawal. Japanese troops entered the city on August 9, raising the Rising Sun flag over government buildings. The fall of Beiping was a blow, but not the end. Rather, it was the beginning of a far larger nightmare. Within weeks, the war spread to Shanghai, Nanjing, and central China. Japan had expected a quick victory. Instead, it had stepped into a war that would last 8 brutal years. The image that inspired this documentary, a lone Chinese soldier staring down a Japanese patrol, was likely taken in the early hours of July 8. The man's identity is unknown. He was one of tens of thousands. His rifle was slung across his back. His eyes burned with fire. That image became a symbol. It was printed in underground newspapers, passed around by students, and later reprinted by Allied news outlets as evidence of China's defiance. In a war of tanks and aircraft, sometimes the most powerful weapon is will. That photograph was the climax of a decade of humiliation and the beginning of a national awakening. The fall of Beiping in early August 1937 was a strategic defeat, but for many in China, it marked the moral birth of resistance. The Chinese nationalist government, under Chiang Kai-shek, declared a full state of war. Provinces were ordered to prepare for mobilization. Propaganda posters spread across cities urging people to defend the nation, expel the invader. More than just soldiers took up the call. Teachers, merchants, rickshaw pullers, and former warlords began sending sons and supplies to the front. Thousands of students left universities to volunteer. A widespread patriotic wave surged through the countryside. At the same time, Chinese forces scrambled to modernize. New divisions were raised in Sichuan, Guangxi, and Hunan. The Soviet Union, wary of Japanese expansion, began sending aircraft and advisors. Although China lacked industrial capacity, makeshift weapons factories were set up in caves, basements, and temples. But the cost was immediate and brutal. By the end of August 1937, Chinese casualties in the Marco Polo Bridge region alone had reached 15,000 to 20,000, many of them civilian. Entire neighborhoods of Wanping, Beiping, and Tianjin were reduced to rubble. Japanese artillery had destroyed bridges, homes, temples, and water supplies. Civilians who had stayed behind were subjected to forced relocations, executions, and rape, early signs of the atrocities that would soon define the war in places like Nanjing. Refugees flooded south by the millions. Some walked for weeks to reach Nanjing or Wuhan. Disease, famine, and exposure claimed thousands before the Japanese even reached them. China's psychological wounds deepened. But unlike the past, where foreign invasions were met with resignation, this time rage turned to resilience. To the Japanese high command, the Marco Polo Bridge was supposed to be a containable flashpoint, a quick show of force to extract more concessions from China. Instead, it ignited a war that Tokyo was unprepared to fight on such a massive scale. By mid-August, Japan had deployed over 300,000 troops into China. New fronts opened in Shanghai, Hangzhou, and Nanjing. Logistics chains stretched thin. Budget lines exploded. For a nation still dependent on imports for oil and rubber, the scale of occupation posed a long-term risk. But Japanese military culture, particularly among its officer corps, saw withdrawal as dishonor. Once fighting began, backing down became politically and culturally impossible. Japan doubled down. By the end of 1937, Tokyo declared that it would no longer negotiate with the Qing government and would seek a new political order in East Asia, one that excluded Chinese sovereignty. This position would lock Japan into a total war in China, one that it could not win easily, and which would ultimately draw it into conflict with the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union in the coming years. The Marco Polo Bridge Incident permanently altered the strategic landscape of East Asia. For China, it forced unity between the nationalists and communists, however uneasy, and ended years of internal civil war, at least temporarily. For Japan, it marked a fatal overextension. Their military victories came fast, but pacifying the Chinese population would prove impossible. For the world, it signaled the opening shot of World War II in Asia, more than 2 years before Hitler invaded Poland. The League of Nations issued a mild condemnation, but did little else. Western powers, still reeling from the Great Depression and fearful of war, watched from the sidelines. But in China, this was not a rehearsal. This was the real war. Perhaps the greatest impact of the Marco Polo Bridge incident was psychological. For decades, Chinese civilians had endured foreign humiliation, first by Western powers, then by Japan. They had watched ports fall under foreign control. Railroads had been leased, treaties signed under duress, sovereignty slowly chipped away. But after July 1937, the mood shifted. The contempt that the soldier showed, standing before the Japanese patrol with defiance, became a national emotion. Suddenly, surrender was no longer tolerable. Even in defeat, China was discovering its modern soul. One poem written by a refugee schoolteacher during that month reads, "Our bridges break. Our cities burn. But our voices rise. Like thunder in the smoke." The image of the Chinese soldier glaring at the Japanese troops near the Marco Polo Bridge began circulating through underground resistance networks. It wasn't officially published by the nationalist government at first. But by 1939, as China sought to rally support from foreign powers, the image became a rallying symbol, printed on posters, postcards, and eventually reproduced in Allied newspapers. It would later appear in US wartime propaganda, alongside captions like "China stands tall." Today, the identity of the soldier remains unknown. But in many museums and textbooks, he is described with one word: resistance. The Marco Polo Bridge stands to this day. Weathered by war, rebuilt by peace, it remains a silent witness to one of the most critical turning points in modern Asian history. Its ancient stones, once carved with dragons and emperors, now bear the echoes of rifle fire, boot steps, and a choice that changed a nation. When that unnamed soldier of the Chinese 29th Army showed contempt toward the Japanese troops on that fateful morning in July 1937, he likely had no idea that history was watching. His act was not grand. It was not staged. It was not part of a plan. But it was real. In his silent defiance, just a glare, a posture, a refusal to yield, he captured the raw edge of a national awakening. His was the face of a China that would no longer kneel. The Marco Polo Bridge Incident is sometimes labeled in textbooks as the beginning of the Second Sino-Japanese War. But it was more than a military engagement. It was a line in the sand between a fading colonial order and the unyielding birth of national identity. From that moment, China fought, not just to win a war, but to reclaim dignity. And even as cities fell and lives were lost by the millions in the years that followed, that spirit, the one captured in a single photograph, refused to die. In the end, wars are not remembered only by the battles won or lost, but by the people who chose to stand when standing was hardest. And on that bridge, in the heat of a Beijing summer, one soldier stood taller than an empire.